We are officially 1 day away from the Texas Senate primary. Well, primaries across the state of Texas, but really focusing on the Texas Senate primary for the 2026 November elections. Now, these are going to be really important races tomorrow between James Talarico and Jasmine Crockett to be the Democratic nominee, and Ken Paxton, John Cornyn, and Wesley Hunt to be the Republican nominee. Throughout today's video, we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically the Democratic race, where I believe the race will be called tomorrow, and we will know the Democratic nominee tomorrow. Versus the Republican race, I'm still going to give you my final prediction, but we're ultimately not going to talk as much about that race in today's video, given the fact that we're going to have months ahead to speak on the race more specifically between two remaining candidates in a runoff election, if that's what happens. Of course, I could be wrong in my prediction, but you'll see later on in the video that I ultimately believe that the Republican primary will go into a runoff. So with this said, let's go ahead and start by looking at the latest polls in the race for Democrats and Republicans. So in the race for Democrats, the latest Emerson College poll conducted from the 26th through the 28th with 850 likely voters said that 6% ahead was for Talarico, 52% for Talarico, 46% for Crockett. That puts him over that 50% threshold that he needs to win outright if this poll was to be accurate. Of course, we see other polls throughout this race, including public policy polling, which was a Democratic sponsor, Lone Star Rising PAC, Talarico +6, without Talarico hitting that 50% threshold. Blueprint polling, Talarico +12, 52% to 40% with Crockett. University of Texas and Tyler Center for Opinion Research, Crockett +18, YouGov, Crockett +12, and these go back into the beginning of February and the end of June, really. We could go further than that as well. But really looking at the most latest polling has Talarico up, but there's ultimately still room for error there, and Crockett ultimately could win this race given some of the polling that we've seen as well, and given the campaign that she's ran. She's well known across the state of Texas, and while she didn't have as long to run this campaign, she ultimately could end up winning against James Talarico tomorrow. Of course, I'll leave my final prediction at the end with graphic screens, which I think could help you guys get a better picture of the idea that I believe the margins could be. Of course, I could be wrong on those as well, and we'll talk more about that later in the video. But at this point, Talarico seems to be ahead, at least on polling-wise, to Crockett in the latest polling, at least. Moving on to the Republican primary, where we have not seen a poll since, let's see, the Blueprint polling had Paxton +24, and this one was between Paxton and Hunt and did not have Cornyn in on this race. So ultimately that's why Paxton was able to get over that 50% threshold. But any of the polling with all three of them, we see that it ultimately will go into a runoff likely. So that includes Quantus Insights, Emerson College. All of these polling suggest that Paxton is ahead on the regard of receiving, 40% of the vote, 43% of the vote, +4 to Cornyn, 36 for Cornyn, 37 for Cornyn. So +4 for Paxton in this poll, +6 for Paxton in this poll. But ultimately, we see overall that it's going to be a difficult match for Paxton to overcome the odds and win straight out tomorrow. Of course, it's possible. I'm not going to deny it, but I think at this moment, it's very unlikely that that happens. So, moving on into the prediction aspect of the video, we're going to look at the Texas Democratic Senate primary winner on Polymarket, where the odds have continued to rise in James Talarico's favor. He's sitting at a 76% chance of winning to Crockett's 23% for tomorrow night's primary race. So we'll see what happens on that regard, and of course you'll get my final prediction later on, but I wanted to make note that the prediction betting odds also have Talarico in an advantage for tomorrow to Crockett, as well as polling does. Moving on to Polymarket on the Republican side, there is a 4% chance, according to Polymarket, that a candidate will win outright tomorrow, meaning Ken Paxton or John Cornyn gets over that 50% threshold to ultimately win tomorrow night and not go into a runoff. So 4% chance, very unlikely in a lot of people's minds that will happen, given the circumstances of the race. And given the aspect of polling and such, it just seems more likely that Ken Paxton will ultimately end up going into a runoff with likely John Cornyn, but we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So at this point, 4% chance of the Texas Republican primary going to, pretty much a 96% chance of it going to a runoff, 4% chance of that primary being decided tomorrow. Also, if you go into who will win the primary on the Republican side, prediction markets also have Ken Paxton ahead on that note as well. Of course, even though that election will likely be months away, given the fact that it's likely, I want to emphasize the fact that it's likely, it's not necessarily certain, that it will go into a runoff after tomorrow. With that, I want to take a note. I want to take a look back at the 2018 Senate election here in Texas. Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke faced off, and Ted Cruz only won by 2.6%. Democrats are hoping to not only capitalize off that, but ultimately end up winning this race in November. Who do I think the candidate is to do that? I'll be completely honest. I think the matchup that Democrats have the best shot at doing that is running James Talarico against Ken Paxton. I think that ultimately just seems like the call for me that I believe would be the most likely scenario where Democrats are able to perform better in this race. And I think that could help them at the end of the day. So looking back at this race, Ted Cruz narrowly won. I mean, we were so close to having Ted Cruz lose this election. And it seems very shocking, especially just 2 years after he ran for president and came in second place. So ultimately, Ted Cruz won the race by 2.6%. But given the fact that Ken Paxton, who is arguably worse than Ted Cruz in some aspects, and especially campaigning and his scandals and such, this could really shape out to be the most interesting race in Texas that we've seen in a very long time, even more interesting than that of the 2018 race. So with all of that said, I want to move into my prediction aspect of today's video. So I want to begin by talking about the obvious race that I believe will go into a runoff election, and that is the Republican primary. So ultimately, I believe that the race will look a little something like this, similar to some of the final polling. Ken Paxton sitting somewhere around 40% of the vote, to John Cornyn just about 4 points behind, and Wesley Hunt sitting about 23%. Of course, this could be very wrong, and I wouldn't be surprised if Wesley Hunt actually does not win as much of the vote as I give him in this exact prediction. But this is what I would say, final prediction on the race for the Republican side, where Ken Paxton and John Cornyn would advance to a runoff in the final at the end of the night, with all of the votes cast, no one receiving over 50% of the vote, ultimately meaning that Ken Paxton and John Cornyn would face off in a runoff, and Wesley Hunt would be eliminated at this point in the race. So, of course, again, this could be very wrong. I would not be surprised at all. I wouldn't be surprised if Ken Paxton and maybe even John Cornyn's numbers are a bit better and Wesley Hunt's are worse. And I also wouldn't be surprised if Wesley Hunt's able to perform a little bit better than I expect him to. So we'll completely have to see tomorrow what those results look like. But this, of course, is my final prediction for the Republican side. Moving to the Democratic side, where I believe that this is the most consequential race for Democrats as far as a primary goes this election cycle, we see that I have James Talarico ultimately winning this race tomorrow night. Somewhere sitting around 51.5% of the vote, 51.54%, to Jasmine Crockett at 48.46%. I also want to note with both predictions that there are some less known candidates who could receive some votes in both primaries, in the Republican primary and Democratic primary. I did not calculate those into my percentages, so if you're wondering about that, that is why. So these margins, of course, are not going to be 100% accurate, because there are going to be people who don't vote for either of these two candidates or either of the three candidates in the Republican field. So, of course, if you're wondering about that, that is why it looks the way it does. So, moving on. James Talarico sitting at about 51.54% of the vote. Jasmine Crockett at 48.46%. This could be a wrong prediction as well. You see how close I really have this race. I mean, within, just a couple of percentage points between Talarico and Jasmine Crockett. But I ultimately believe, given the prediction markets, given the historical odds in the state of Texas, given how James Talarico has handled his campaign and been able to run a really, I think, arguably fantastic campaign, whether you sit on the right or left, you have to give him credit where credit is due. And ultimately, just his change in trajectory, his new vision of politics, and the new vision he brings, I believe, could set him over that 50% threshold to be the Democratic nominee tomorrow, and I ultimately believe that's what's going to happen. I believe James Talarico wins the Democratic primary for Texas Senate tomorrow night, defeating Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Of course, with all of this said, let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you believe that Jasmine Crockett's able to pull this off? Do you believe, like I do, that James Talarico is going to win tomorrow night? Also, what do you think about the Republican primary? Do you believe that Ken Paxton could win straight out? Do you believe that the runoff will be between Paxton and Cornyn? Let me know what you think about both of these races in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Can't wait to see the results tomorrow night and begin to talk about the Texas race on the national stage, where we're talking about one Democratic nominee and one Republican nominee, although my prediction is we'll still be talking about that Republican nominee for a couple more months. So thank you guys again so much for watching. I appreciate it so much. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video and comment down below your thoughts as well, and I'll see you guys in the next video.